Hi, and welcome to Spiritual Stew, the podcast where we talk about our spiritual journeys through interviews and conversations. This is not a space for debate or argument. We're building a community where we can discuss this topic with respect and empathy. You're welcome regardless of your religion, faith, or lack of either or both. Today, our guest is Moses Siregar. Moses, before we get started, tell me a little about yourself.
Hey, Scott, thanks. Well, we met because I was a spec fic writer at one point. I wrote a couple epic fantasy novels, and those are still out there on Amazon and places like that. But I'm looking at turning 50 this year, knock on wood. I personally, I guess, what I do professionally is I'm a professional astrologer, actually. I've been doing that for 31 years now. I've studied Western and Eastern or Vedic astrology. And I'm considered, I suppose, a leading figure doing what's called locational astrology, which is where we look at where the planets were when you were born and use that to try to understand what different places are going to be like for you to be in. But my bachelor's degree is in religion, and so I've been quite a seeker. I've been around the block spiritually, where I've been a part of getting in the headspace of many of the different major religions of the world. And some of that was studying it in college. I mean, that was kind of more of a bonus. I got to read some extra texts and, get a grade for it and get a bachelor's degree out of it. But personally, I was raised Episcopalian. So nothing too serious there. I don't know how often we went to church, might have been once a month or something like that. So I grew up thinking like a Christian, very much. And not, Episcopalian's it's fairly light Christianity, I suppose, compared to some of them. So, not a lot of heavy guilt, not a lot of heavy anything really. But I believed in heaven and hell and things like that, and a lot of those kind of Christian beliefs. And, and even though you'll hear a lot of today, I'm not really particularly specifically a Christian, if you will. I say the Lord's Prayer to my kids every night before they go to bed because my mom did that for me when I was a kid. And I respect anything that gets you closer to your version of God, makes you a kinder person, more loving person. Anything that really raises your frequency, so to speak. And I'm quite liberal in that respect, as well as in other respects too. But so I'm pretty open-minded like that, and I find that I can kind of often speak different religious languages because I've been a part of different things. So, for example, if I have clients who are Christians, I can talk about God and I can put things in that language, and I'm very comfortable with it. But I can talk to a Buddhist and put things in a very different sort of language, or a Hindu and do that sort of thing. So I try not to get too fixed on any hard beliefs. One thing that's a little unusual about me, not that I'm the only person who has sort of followed this woman, but there's a saint from India. Usually she goes by Amma, which means mother, but her longer name is Mata Amritanandamayi, which is a mouthful. But she's from Kerala, southern India, and she's world famous. She's the famous hugging saint. You might have seen her on CNN or something.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. Right. I've heard that version of her appellation.
Yeah. And I think she's quote unquote hugged 40 million people, and it looks like a hug. I can tell you from experience and having brought a lot of people to see her that it's more like a spiritual transmission of some sort, but it does look a lot like a hug. And so I've been following her, if you will, since 1995. I would say she's my spiritual teacher if I have one. And her example is very much about love and service, and it's not really particularly Hindu, although if she talks to Indians, she can talk about Krishna and talk about all the Hindu stories. But I think she's got bigger fish to fry, or she just wants to be more universal than that. So she is a tremendous humanitarian. I mean, if you look at her objectively, she's running dozens of projects around the world in terms of charitable things. And she's, spoken to the UN. She's won the Gandhi King Award for nonviolence. And so she's one of the only humans I've been able to look at and say, I actually will follow her example, because she's clearly helping people and clearly in it for the right reasons, as far as I can see. And I've been, around her and her scene to some degree since 1995. So that's, if I had one path, I had to pick one, I'd probably say, I'm an Amma devotee or something like that. But she's not forcing you to believe any certain thing either. She just seems to be full of love, and that's, I think, what it's ultimately about.
We
But
can use a lot more of that in this world, that's for sure.
right, right. Yeah, and then along the way, I mean, I've read the Tao Te Ching probably over 100 times. I kind of brainwashed myself with it when I was like a college student, by just really drilling that philosophy into my head.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very humble philosophy. It starts with he who speaks does not know, and he who knows does not speak. So I guess I'm a big hypocrite here today, trying to talk about some of this stuff. But that's kind of the Taoist sage is one that doesn't want to be seen, doesn't want to be known. He wants to have a profound influence that is not about putting himself out there. And so it's quite a contrast from how we kind of live in the Western world, where it's all about you and your following and being a leader. And Taoism, I really appreciate how it was like spiritually the inverse of a lot of those things. And so I think that to some degree has kept me humbler over the years by kind of following a philosophy like that. But I've been around Hinduism. I got started reading the autobiography of a yogi, which is a world famous book. I think it's up there with things like the Bible and the Tao Te Ching in terms of like copies that have been printed and stuff like that. I don't know the actual numbers, but I think it's one of the big ones that has really inspired a lot of people spiritually. And that introduced me to the religion or the spirituality of India and all the saints that are from there. And that got me into wanting to meditate and do a bit of yoga. Although I'm not much of a hatha physical yoga kind of person, but more some of the meditative yoga I've been into here and there a little bit. And that led me ultimately toward Amma. But again, I don't think of her so much as a Hindu, even though she's quite Indian. And Vedanta is a kind of an aspect of Hinduism where it's more of a non-dual philosophy. And I definitely explored a bit of that as well. And, that looks more like a bunch of people sitting around with someone usually up on the stage who's kind of leading the satsang, they would often call it. And in Vedanta, really, the idea is that you're already there. Stop searching.
Right.
It's this, and so that's another kind of inversion of what we usually do. We seek, and Vedanta, you're trying to rest into the true nature that you already have. And so I like these contrasts. I like dialectic. I like combining opposite things and finding some interesting combination of those that somehow raises it to a higher kind of vibration. Buddhism, I did a deep dive into that for a while. I used to live down the street from Naropa, the university in Boulder, Colorado, which is like really Buddhist based. And so I've studied with some Buddhist teachers and read a lot of books on from Buddhist teachers and that kind of meditation style, and a little bit of Tibetan kind of Buddhism with that. And ultimately, Buddhism doesn't work quite as well for me, although I like the philosophy of it. I like the desire to the bodhisattva vow. You're going to keep reincarnating until everybody's enlightened. I mean, it's a very purely selfless kind of intention, which I think is a really beautiful intention. But in most Buddhist traditions, there isn't really something to surrender to. You meditate and there's mindfulness, and you're in the emptiness, and it's not about somethingness; it's about nothing. But that nothing is kind of full in the end and rich, and you find your Buddha nature there. But I do for me, I think everybody has a different path. I like to surrender to something. I like to have something to kind of put my head on the ground in a salutation pose and get into a less egoic space in my head where I'm offering myself to something greater and asking for guidance. And that kind of works for me. And that's why I respect Buddhism. And I take my kids to Buddhist sacred sites like the stupas. We have one that's nearby that's really, really wonderful. So I really respect Buddhism a lot, but it doesn't quite fit me as well. I took most of my classes in college studying with an Islamic studies professor named Alan Godless. He has the most ironic name ever. It's Godlas. But especially considering that Islam is all about God, even more than I would say even in Judaism or Christianity. A Muslim is technically one who surrenders to God. And he was the coolest professor at the University of Georgia religion program back in the 90s that I was attending. He was like a hippie from Berkeley, I think, at one point, but he was also kind of a Sufi, and that's more of like the mystical hippie spiritual side of Islam, and so he got the mystical side of it quite a lot. And I found through his classes that he really transported me into the mind that a Muslim might have. And I found that very compelling actually at the time, and very interesting to kind of see what that can feel like. And I have issues with some aspects of Islam. I mean, Muhammad was sort of channeling the Quran while he was fighting wars. And so there is some militaristic language in the Quran that I'm not really comfortable with. But the part about surrendering to God, I think is quite beautiful, and I like that quite a bit, you know. And I mean, I took classes on Confucianism and Japanese religions and Native American religions, and I've been around Native American stuff a little bit. You know, I've been in sweat lodges, and I've kind of found my own relationship at times to animal spirits that seem to show up in my life and have some sort of message for me or something like that. And that's very Native American as a religious kind of path. And then through all of this, like I said, I practice astrology, which I was just talking to someone yesterday about this actually, and this person came from a Christian background, and she's a pretty open-minded as a Christian, I suppose, and she says, you know, there are references to the stars and things like this and the heavens in the Bible, and I reminded her that the three wise men were astrologers. They were following a conjunction in the sky, if I'm not mistaken, certainly some kind of star.
Yeah.
But the church, you know, over time has gone through different phases, and different old white men have wanted to sort of mold it in their own sort of ways according to their own dogmas and so on. And so, you know, my understanding is that there have been times where these different councils have changed the Bible, chosen which books to include. Let's leave out the part about reincarnation, or let's not make it look like it's too much about astrology. But, you know, as we were saying, like, okay, astrology is a thing you can observe, and you can decide if you think it is something or it isn't something. After 31 years of practicing it, I know it's something, but that's just my opinion. But I do know that, and so if that's the case, okay, let's use an if then. You know, if astrology is something, then who made the planets and the sun and the stars and the moon, and if it does reflect our lives like a mirror, and that's my contention, that it's like a great big mirror in the sky that is utterly profound. Well, if that is true, who did that? Was that Satan? Was that? I don't know. We'll call it God. We'll use the metaphor of God, and so to me, it's kind of it's like a living religious text in that you can always see it operating and reflecting us. And I've recently come to this new way of putting it, which is that, you know, think of AI. Okay, so the idea is that AI soon enough will be vastly more intelligent than we are. And at that point, we have absolutely no capacity to understand it, because we will be like, you know, the lowest IQ person on earth trying to understand Albert Einstein's theories or something like that. Like, you can't understand it if it's that much smarter than you. You can't. That's by definition. So astrology almost seems to operate like that, like it's this vast sort of AI that here we are trying to make sense out of it, and we try. But it seems to have a kind of intelligence of some sort, or an order that is vastly more than we can really comprehend. Because if it really does work, and here's where it gets really trippy, then there's how many billion, 7 billion or something of us at this point, you know, billions of us running around, where every single person, the heavens in the sky would mirror their lives in utterly profound ways. And I would not fault anyone for rejecting that notion on its face, because that sounds absurd. How could that, like, it would be so complex. The computer, the AI, if you will, would be so incredibly intelligent and vast that it doesn't make sense to our little brains, frankly. But I have dedicated a lot of my life to studying it, and it does seem to have unmistakable, powerful reflectiveness, you know, toward us. And that tells me that, you know, I think maybe we looked to the heavens one day and said, we'd like to see ourselves, we'd like to see signs, we'd like to see guidance. As far as I can tell, you know, the universe said, okay, well, let me show you some of this then, and gave us something to blow our minds. And so for me, that path has been, you know, getting so deep into that it just, I feel like I can just begin to glimpse the vastness of it, you know. And I do work with clients, like, so I talk to people every day, and we track, oh, what happened when you lived in New York, and what happened when you lived in San Francisco, and what happened when you lived over here in this other corner of the world. And it's every day for me. It's an experiment. It's a question. It's a hypothesis. And it is, does this work? Does this actually reflect what happened to you to a sort of statistically significant, meaningful degree? And I find it does. It does. And so my clients, and so my clients, I think overall, I tend to hear a whole lot of, wow, oh my God, I can't believe that. That's nuts. Whoa, I didn't even tell you that place was great. You told me you thought it'd be great for me. Like, it's wild, man. It's so wild. It's so beautiful.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
You mentioned two schools, I guess, of uh, astrology that you studied, the Ayurvedic and the Western.
Right.
I am passingly familiar with, I guess, Western astrology. I am not familiar at all with Ayurvedic astrology. If you gave me like a
Right.
5,000 foot, you know, view, what's the difference between the two?
Okay. Well, historically, they likely have most of their origin, most of what we call horoscopic astrology. And I will admit, I'm not the history of astrology isn't my forte, but I can talk about it a little bit. So horoscopic astrology, as we know it today, pretty much came out of this Hellenistic era. I forget the years exactly, but we're not too far away from the birth of Christ sort of years. I mean, some of it was before, some of it's after, but that's roughly the time period we're talking about. Let's say 2,000 plus years ago. Now, there is some astrology from ancient India that's like more like 5,000 years old. And they do integrate that into the horoscopic astrology that came from the Hellenistic area.
Mhm.
So they do have a similar root, and that's what makes it interesting to study them. Is they're cousins very much, like they have the same 12 houses, the same 12 signs, and a lot of the same basic theory, but they diverged enough that they're fairly different too. Now in India, I think what happened, I think part of why the Indian astrology is quite enduring, is they really linked the astrology to their spiritual philosophy of life, a Vedic kind of philosophy. So, for example, in Hinduism, like they'll say that there's 12 houses in astrology, which is that's how we divide the sky into 12 slices of life. Like, oh, this house is about relationships, and this house is about your home, and this is about your career. Well, they group those houses according to four aims of life, and the fourth aim of life is moksha, is moving toward enlightenment or spiritual liberation. So their astrology has a deep rooted, spiritual philosophy baked into it, and you can't really understand it properly without putting that spiritual context into it. And sometimes the Westerners do that, and sometimes they don't, because in the West, we've gotten very, quote unquote, enlightened at times, where we're more scientific and rational and things like that. And so some people who do Western astrology don't really particularly link it to spirituality, but I would argue you're not getting it if you're doing it that way.
Mhm. Mhm.
um, I mean, in Hinduism is the most ancient religion on the earth. The Vedic stuff, it is the most ancient religion on the earth, other than like goddess religions. I took a class on goddess religions when I was getting my religious degree. So you go back, many more thousands of years, and people had the little chubby goddess statues, and that that was the thing back in the day. But eventually we get India, and a lot of stuff starts coming out of there, and Buddhism kind of arises out of that essentially, as well. So there is a real, I do find as I get older too, there's something compelling about something that's literally thousands of years old.
Sure,
uh,
sure.
I mean, that's it's kind of interesting, isn't it? And that's why take something like acupuncture and Chinese medicine, and all the theories of all the points there. I mean, that's, again, it's a thing that's thousands of years old that we barely understand today. And there is that fallacy of modernity or something like that, where we think that anything that's newer is more evolved than something that's older. But the older you get, and tell me if you disagree or anything, Scott, but I mean, I think the older you get, the more you realize that some of the really wisest and most brilliant people are dead now,
Mhm.
and you were around them, and now you're kind of, I'm almost 50, so I'm sort of middle-aged to older guy now, and it falls to you and your generation to try to carry the wisdom. And you realize that we lost a lot of these folks that really had even more than we did,
Yeah,
and so over time we lose a lot of wisdom, and and things like that. And we would probably be better served to pay more attention to some of that ancient stuff sometimes, and try to integrate it with what's modern.
I think you're 100% right. You know, I think that we don't respect our elders in American culture to
Hmm.
the same degree that uh, other cultures do. I think, I got reminded recently of my granddad who passed away a couple of years ago. He was 93. He would have been 95 in 2 days.
uh,
And it was the kind of thing where, I have reminders in my calendar for everything. And I saw his birthday reminder,
mm,
and it brought him to mind. And he was easily one of the wisest people that I knew and that I
mm,
know now. And he was far from perfect, but there's
Right.
something to be said for 90 years of life experience. He lived through some of the hardest times in our country, and in one of the most poor places in the United States, in the eastern part of North Carolina during that period of time. Um, Second only probably to the Dust Bowl. Um, and so, I listened to everything that he said and took it to heart. So, and I think that ancient things, I mean, there is a fallacy about uh, ancientness too. I mean,
Right.
but I think that there is something to uh, listening to, if people have been saying some variation on the same thing across cultures for thousands of years, then maybe that thing they've been saying
Hmm.
has some merit to it, uh, for sure.
And to get back to your question about Vedic and Western astrology, then I'm good at going on tangents, but so they have this similar root, okay, and a lot of the same sort of ideas. I would say the Hindu side has more of their religion and spirituality baked into that. Now, the confusing part for a lot of people, if you do get into it a little bit, is in India, they follow a more sidereal approach to the zodiac. Sidereal meaning to reckon according to the stars, basically. And in the West, we follow a tropical zodiac. And that is that we align the zodiac, which is really just a symbolic 360-degree circle with 12 signs. We align that zodiac to our seasons.
Mm.
So when we have because basically, you can watch, okay, so the ecliptic is the path of the sun. Like if you watch the sun every day, it's going to travel in a circle, basically. And that's the ecliptic, okay? And that's the circle that we play with in astrology mostly. And around that circle, you can give it 360 degrees and you can divide it into 12 sections, and they're each 30 degrees wide, and those are the signs. So you have an archetype of 12 zodiac signs of this, this circle. Well, the question is, where does the circle begin? Because we can look at the sun right now in the sky. Today is March 27th, 2025, and the Western astrologers will say the sun is in the sign of Aries because the spring just started, right? We just entered the spring. And in Western astrology or tropical astrology, which is predominantly tropical, we would say, when spring begins, the sun is at exactly 000 Aries. It begins at that very moment. And so that's one way to sort of pin the zodiac to a circle, right? You have to slide that circle around until you get a stopping point and you fix it there, basically. But ours in the West tends to be around the seasons. And you could say, well, it's the seasons of the Northern Hemisphere, which is where 90% of us live. But that's a criticism you could make, is that it wouldn't sort of work as well in the Southern Hemisphere. But that doesn't, I don't think it's a terribly strong criticism. But so in India, then, they don't care about the seasons. It has nothing to do with the seasons. Now, some of them do tropical astrology. Some of them are tropical. Some of the people in the West are sidereal, but predominantly the West is tropical and the Indians are sidereal. So what the Indians do is they have to fix their zodiac to something in the sky, meaning a star. And so they have a different problem where you could get 10 different Vedic astrologers, and their zodiacs will be similar, like very close to each other, but they'll each use a different star to kind of pin the zodiac somewhere. So there's and it's called an ayanamsha, is like sort of the choice that you make there. And the Indian government officially endorses an ayanamsha. And so that's kind of wild. Imagine the US government officially endorsing the tropical zodiac or something like that. But the most official one, which is the one that I follow, I guess official in India, but also probably the most widely used, is called Lahiri, based on a guy named Lahiri. But that one, what that does is it takes the star called Spica, or in India they call it Chitra, the same star, Spica Chitra. And in that system, they say Spica or Chitra is the very, 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 very end of the sign Virgo, like 29, 59, 59 Virgo. And so that's where they put the pin in the circle and say, okay, now we're going to create a 360-degree circle where that's the fixed point, And what happens is, because of the precession of the equinoxes, there's about a 26,000-year wobble that the Earth does as it wobbles around its own axis and does a full 360. And so because of that, these zodiacs separate from each other about one sign every 2,200 years or something like that. Um, and so one of the biggest, I will say, if you're a skeptic of astrology, or if you've just been around, anyone who's ever been skeptical of astrology, the first point they probably bring up is they'll say, "Oh, well, the astrologers think that, the zodiac is over here, and they don't realize there's a precession of the equinoxes, and therefore it's off by a sign," and this kind of business. And I mock it because it's dumb, because it's literally not even understanding what astrologers really kind of think, which is that we know that. we know that. It's just that the Westerners do it tropically and they fix it to the seasons, and the more so the Indians do it sidereally and they fix it to a star. And it's a conscious choice. I mean, or at least it should be. Some astrologers might not have thought a whole lot about that, but so I do find that criticism of astrology incredibly empty. Now, there are some good criticisms of astrology that I think are better than that, but that's not one. I mean, we know what we're doing. We know how we formed our zodiac, and we're using it deliberately. So anyway, that is a thing you will come across all the time from skeptics. And
yeah, you would think that accusing people who look at the stars of not understanding what they're looking at as being an odd accusation.
Yeah, I'm with you, man. Like, and if it was that way, well, sure. I mean, that would be quite a criticism, but it's based on a misunderstanding of what astrologers actually know about astrology.
Mhm. So what you're saying is that at least at its base, there is a bigger connection between astrology and astronomy than a typical layperson might think. That there's,
Mm-hmm.
Because of the observations that astrologers make of the stars, that they understand astronomy better than your average person might think they do.
Yeah, and it depends on what kind of astrologer you're talking about. You know what I mean? I mean, you might have an auntie who's read some astrology books and might not have thought terribly deeply about some of this stuff, or an uncle for that matter. But you might have a really serious intellectual who's really understands this stuff quite well. Johannes Kepler was an astrologer. I mean, the guy did horoscopes, and we still use some of his theories in astrology today. He had this whole theory, these theories around minor aspects, which is like the separation between the planets around the circle. So if two planets are 72 degrees apart on the circle, that's a quintile. It's based on dividing the circle by 5. You get 5 times 72 is 360. And so, and there's like harmonic theories and all this kind of stuff. So there's some really intelligent, nerdy people, doing stuff with astrology. And there's some people who are following more pop astrology stuff, and they're probably more like people trying to be psychics, but they kind of use astrology a little bit to help them. So,
Well, Isaac Newton was an alchemist. I mean, people in those times, their understanding of science and the mystical was interwoven, and
right.
I think that there is no reason why that can't still be the case on some level.
Yeah, Isaac Newton was, as you might have guessed, then someone into astrology too. There is a famous quote. I think it's from him, but I think it might not be a real quote. But there's a great quote from him on astrology that might be fake, but let's see. Oh, yeah. Supposedly he says to Sir Halley, "I have studied the matter, you have not." A famous anecdote attributed to Isaac Newton. But anyway, we can kind of try to figure out if that's actually true or not. Some historians argue the quote might be oversimplified or embellished. So that's been around for a while. And if you don't know it, the reason why math and science and everything is as advanced as it is today, you could argue is because of astrology, because the reason why we started to develop math and astronomy and science is because the ancient rulers wanted to have good astrologers. They wanted to have accurate positions for where the planets are, so they could figure out when to invade their neighbors and stuff like that. And so that is literally the origin of us getting really curious about this stuff, is so that we could do astrology, and that's kind of neat. And astrology and astronomy were kind of the same thing for thousands of years, or quite a long time. I might have the numbers wrong on that, but certainly quite a long time. And eventually, of course, it kind of diverged, as we became quote unquote enlightened and stuff like that.
And regardless of what some people in our country think today, brown people were the ones that came up with all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, a lot of that was in the Middle East.
And Muslims and Indians, or some of whom
Right.
I guess were Muslims, came up with, calculus. Well, not calculus. I think that was actually Newton, but came up with a lot of algebra and a lot of
Mhm.
other higher math and the concept of zero and astronomy and astrology. And yeah, so that makes perfect sense to me. That there are things birthed out of these beliefs that are just as valid today as they were, you know, 3, 4, 5,000 years ago.
Right. And in India, one of their systems in astrology, the part that's ancient and specific to them that they kind of like fused with more of the Hellenistic astrology, were what's called the nakshatras. And there's 27 or 28 nakshatras. And they were developed, I'm looking up here on Google right now, somewhere between 2700 to 1700 BCE. So that's almost 5,000 years ago. They had divided the sky into 12 slices. You know, the zodiac sort of divides it into 12, but they divided it into, I meant to say 27 slices. They divided it into 27 or 28 nakshatras, and those followed certain stars. So a certain nakshatra will be centered around a certain star generally, or a little constellation, and that'll be connected with some of the Hindu mythology. And so they were doing that maybe 5,000 years ago. And so, yeah, to your point, you know.
And so many cultures, we look at the megalithic structures and other structures that still exist from prehistory. Look at the stars and are built and pointed in directions
Mm,
to look at the stars and to mark their passage. So yeah, there's a lot of significance. I'm literally getting goosebumps just thinking about
hmm
how
hmm
we think that our ancestors were so dumb
Right.
in a lot of ways, but they survived under conditions and thrived under conditions that would kill us in a week.
Mm,
Um, so and they were coming up with these things with technology that they had to invent purpose built for this using the most basic of resources, um, string and basic levers and rocks and water levelers and things like that. They didn't have lasers, no matter what the guy says on Ancient Aliens.
mm, hmm hmm
So, um, so yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So astrology is about as enduring as a belief in God. I mean, it's about as ancient, and, it's one of these thousands of years kind of things. And for some reason, we don't shake it. It's all over different cultures. Different cultures do it differently. And I do look at it a lot like religion, actually. I do think astrologers are capable of arguing over the minutia of these things, just like religious people are. And you do get a lot of like the Western people disagreeing with the Vedic people and vice versa. There is that fundamental arrogance that you get when you're so deep in one tradition that you can't see that another one might also be valid for somebody else. And now I have my own little way of putting it, but it's kind of like, if you look to the heavens and ask God for signs and messages and mirrors to reflect yourself, to understand yourself, as far as I can tell, the universe is willing to oblige us on that. And if the brown people do it different than, the other people or whatever, I don't think God particularly, takes sides in that one.
Mhm.
And you can have, Christians and Muslims and Jews pointing fingers at each other and disagreeing over the minutia of it all, just like you get it in astrology too, because our minds don't want to get that vast. Like if you get exposed to a religion when you're young and you have a profound experience with it, it's going to be very difficult in general for most people, probably, or to some degree, to kind of be open to something else that's just might be just as rich as what you believe, because you've had such a personal experience with it. It speaks
Mhm.
to you, and you felt like you got a message from God, or you got a feeling in your heart, or you've had something that maybe you thought was some kind of little miracle or something like that. And so of course, the natural assumption is, well, that's the truth. Like that's the one. I found it. I was lucky to be born in Arkansas, where, I was able to find the truth of my, Protestant religion or whatever it is. But everybody's doing that, right? And so the kid born in Saudi Arabia is having the same experience, and the kid born in, India is having the same experience, and then they grow up and then they point fingers at each other and say, well, I'm obviously got the truth, and
Yeah.
you're a heathen. And astrologers do the same stupid thing. I mean, and luckily that's one. I'm probably stupid in quite a few ways, but I don't think that's one of them, as far as like I'm open to hearing other perspectives on things and considering them. And so I look at all that and I kind of smile because I just see the blind man touching different parts of the elephant and arguing about it. And that's what
Yeah.
astrologers love to do. And that's why I'm not going to promote myself too hard here, but I call my thing holistic astrology. It's let's try to look at what everybody's got and try to form a better fusion and modern, inclusive approach to all of this, where it doesn't have to be my way is right and your way is wrong. Um, you had asked about, again, the difference between, I think maybe the last thing on the Western and the Vedic astrology.
Mhm.
This might go over some heads a little bit, but remember I was saying the zodiacs are kind of different. Like, so the Westerner says the sun is in Aries right now, and the Vedic astrologer says the sun is in Pisces right now. Well,
Mhm.
you could argue that's a big problem. And in fact, probably most people in astrology would agree with that. However, in my opinion, you're just looking at that elephant from different planes. So the Western astrologer with the seasons. Now, if you relate to your sun sign, or if you relate to somebody else's sun sign and that kind of business, it's because the Western astrology is like the seasons, and we feel the seasons. We feel the heat of summer, we feel the cold of winter. There's a feeling to Capricorn in the middle of winter. There's a feeling to Leo in the middle of summer. And when you get to know people, that's what's so cool about Western astrology is the idea, and this kind of feeds perhaps into our self-importance a little bit, but is that you are this experiment going on where you are an expression of all of these vast, infinite, incredible principles that play out in some orderly, way that you can kind of understand through the logic and lore of astrology. So in that Western side, I think the reason a lot of people kind of get open to astrology through those sun signs is that you are an expression of that thing, and there's a lot of generalities about these signs that tend to hold up as being, pretty damn true. And so that's what Western astrology is like. It's like smelling someone's breath. It's like feeling their personality. When you're in a relationship with somebody, and you're a Libra and they're a Sagittarius or whatever, there's a certain story that kind of plays out in a kind of predictable way to some degree with that. But in India, they're not looking at the seasons again, right? They're looking at
Mhm.
more so the stars. Well, think about how far away the stars are compared to summer, in the northern hemisphere. There's no real comparison there. So what they're looking at is this more objective, distant view of somebody, which is to say, like, just the facts, ma'am. Like, what's your life? Like, who are you? Like, but not really up close and personal. And so that's, I think, the thing that people haven't quite gotten yet. And if you understand that they're looking at different planes, like the Vedic astrologer is looking at your Wikipedia page and telling you just the facts of your life. And the Western astrologer is looking at your yearbook photo and reading, your Facebook feed and smelling your breath, and like they're up in your business. And so it's really complementary when you do it that way. It's like, okay, here's the big picture and here's the up close. So that's something I've worked out for myself that works for me, seems to work for my clients, seems to work. And so yeah, so this is what you get when been doing astrology for 30 years. You think about this stuff a lot.
So we've talked about, what you do. We've talked about what you believe. How did you arrive at this point? What about your upbringing and your young adult life and your young life? What brought you to the point where you're at right now?
Okay. Well, I'll tie in both the astrology and the spirituality aspect, if you will. So my mother was into, and she was studying astrology when I was in the womb. So I've been around it my whole life. And I will say I've had looking back after almost 50 years, like a little bit of a charmed life in terms of my exposure to astrology. Once upon a time, I was the first president of the Association for Young Astrologers. That was a group we started in 2003, 2004. I've done a few things, let's say, and so I've got a few decorated, things I can hang my hat on or whatever, feathers in my cap in the astrology world. And so now I thought my mom was nuts for being into astrology, to be honest with you, and it wasn't until I was like 17 she told me some stuff about my chart one night, and I thought, what the hell is this about? Like, how does she know that about me, So she had all these books. I started reading all of her astrology books and printing out charts of my friends and family, and I just wanted to disprove it to myself. That's all I wanted to do. I was like, I'm not going to be like my mom, and here I am. So that didn't work out really. I got curious about it, and then it started to help me. I started to understand myself better, my relationships better, my people better. my life better, the cycles of my life better. Ultimately, the locations I had lived in, I started to see how they had different purposes and experiences for me. And so I got into it because it was so practical. I just thought it was helpful, and it helped me. So I wanted to help other people with the same tool that had helped me. So that's just been a journey along that route, you know. And spiritually, like I said, I was born in an Episcopal kind of Christian church, grew up in that mindset. And I had this amazing world history teacher, Miss Chadwick. If you're still around, God bless you. And if you're not, God bless you anyway. And she was so knowledgeable about really European history. And so we went through all the, quote unquote world history, which is really just European history. For some reason, we thought that was the world. But she, she did a good enough job of laying into anyone who was willing to think about it, of how messed up some of the things the church had done over the years were. And it really started to make me think about all that. I'm like, wait a minute, this isn't quite what I thought it was, maybe. And then I got into philosophy for a little bit. So I was reading, Western philosophy. I did that for a minute. And then that event happened where my mom, told me about astrology. Then I started thinking about that. And now my dad, he was also named Moses. I'm actually the third. And weirdly enough, I'm descended from a famous Indonesian Christian ministers, like Sumatra being the island, Batak being the tribe, which is like an ancient, even cannibalistic tribe. But I'm descended from some kings in that line, and some, you can look up Emmanuel Siregar online, and you'll see stories about him and how he was the star convert of these Australian missionaries back in the day. They went to this primitive part of Indonesia, and they wanted to convert the heathens and the primitive folks. And the first time they tried, the Batak killed them, and the second time it worked, and it worked because they met my great grandfather Emmanuel, and he became the star convert for them. His dad had been a Christian minister, Johannes Siregar, but Emmanuel really took to it, and he helped them to spread Seventh-day Adventism to that tribe of people. So it's kind of interesting history there. But so my dad, meanwhile, this part of my family line is so interesting. I'll just tell you briefly. So my grandfather Moses came from Indonesia. He was the son of Emmanuel. He gets on a boat in Malaysia, and it's bound for Hawaii around the time of World War II. Illegally, he goes to Hawaii, gets off the ship, and he lies and says he's from the Philippines, and he lied about his age so he could join the war. And they put him on a ship in the Navy, and he's fighting the Japanese. Well, I guess he's feeding the men who are fighting the Japanese on the ship, and he survives, and the ship doesn't sink. And so he makes it back to New York City. And then New York City, he has a kid named Moses and a daughter, as well as my aunt. And then my dad goes on, and I believe he's drafted. I always forget if he's drafted or not, but I believe he was drafted to fight in Vietnam. He makes it home, and I've got his medals to talk about the times he ran onto battlefields to save people and do all these heroic things. And luckily, he dodged all those bullets, because if not, I wouldn't be here. He made it home, but 1976 probably wasn't a whole lot of good care for veterans with PTSD. So he ends up ending his life when I'm 13 months old. However, he leaves behind a few things, and one of those was the autobiography of a yogi. And so I'm like, and I'm a teenager, and my dad has this. Well, I inherit this old copy of the book from my dad, and I read it, and this book has turned a lot of people on to the beauty of the spirituality of India. And so I read that, and I get really lit up by it. I really get inspired by it, and I think, wow, there's this rich spiritual tradition over there in India, and I want to kind of explore that. And so I literally am praying to meet a divinely realized soul, like the ones that Yogananda writes about in his book, these self-realized souls who are able to do all these miracles and different things like that. And I'm praying so hard about that. Honestly, I felt like a kind of a little Hindu like that. And then about maybe 6 months later, I ended up meeting Amma in New York City. She's going to speak. She's going to do her thing in New York City, and I go up there and meet her, and that sets me on that path. And she gives me a mantra. And so, like I said, I say the Lord's Prayer to my kids, but mostly the prayer that I say, if you will, is a mantra. I say it in my head all the time, and it's a Sanskrit mantra that she gave me to chant, and it's something that that kind of works for me. And then I just get really curious, and then I'm like, ooh, and I discovered Taoism somewhere along the way, and the Tao Te Ching speaks to me. And then it just goes, and I just become quite a seeker, and just really exploring all these things. And I'm really fortunate. I got to be in the headspace of lots of different religions. I can kind of think of how a Muslim thinks. I kind of get it, and I kind of get, obviously Christianity because I grew up with it, and Taoism because I immersed myself in the Tao Te Ching, and Buddhism because I've been around that stuff. And I love looking at the world through those different lenses. And I would say they have their strengths and weaknesses, or maybe it's just that they have their specialities or focuses, and so you can kind of get different focus out of different traditions. But yeah, somewhere in my early 20s, then I'm at the University of Georgia. That's where I went to school in Athens, Georgia. And I was really lit up. I also got exposed to this kind of more like New Age stuff, like some channeled material. And I got really inspired by this one. Hilarion was supposedly the ascended master that was kind of about. And he had this whole perspective channeled from this guy in Toronto that says the earth is about to go through this horrible tribulation, and we got to raise the consciousness on the earth before we, blow the whole thing up. And at that age in my early 20s, I believed it. And I was like, you know what? If he's right, I'm going to do my part to try to make this world a little better and try to help us avoid this. So I started a student group called SHARE, which stood for Seeking Harmony and Reaching Enlightenment. And every week, every Thursday, we'd have a different spiritual tradition come and present their point of view to us. And I kind of built this community of college kids at Athens, Georgia, who didn't want to be going out drinking every night. Kids that wanted to learn about meditation and just more sober, spiritually inclined sort of people. And so we built a community of kids like that in the middle of this party college city in Georgia. And I got exposed to things. And that's actually how I found out about Amma, because one of the speakers who came to my group that I started was an Amma devotee. And she taught transcendental meditation and Reiki. Uma, who's still around, or Laura Rose and her partner Uma. And so she starts telling us all these stories about Amma, and I'm thinking, oh my God, this is it. This is what I've been praying for. This is the saint. This is the one I want to meet. And she's going to come to New York in July, and I'm going to, and so I drive up there with a buddy, and we meet her, and I actually had a profound experience the first time I saw her. It used to be you'd sit in line and wait for what's called the darshan, or the hug, the spiritual transmission. And I just saw a lot of miracles happen around this one. I always have. And there was this moment I was sitting there, and there's probably 1,000 people or something in this. It was in a Unitarian church in Manhattan, just on the west of Central Park. And it was like this thing happened somehow, this grace happened somehow, maybe because everybody was just on a really high vibration, just feeling the love and just, meditating and stuff like that. But I actually had this vision, not a vision, but I had an experience for maybe a minute or two where I was able to look around the room with absolute unconditional love for every single person in that room. And it was profound. It was different. And I was like, wow, that's pretty neat. And this is a true story. I had some bread, I had like a couple loaves of bread, and back in the day when you'd see Amma, now they give you a token and you can walk around and get a chai and talk to your friends, and then you go see her when your number gets called. But back in the day, you had to sit and wait in line. So it was a different kind of thing. So me and a whole bunch of people are sitting waiting in line, and so I just start passing this bread around to everybody in the crowd, because I don't know, I just did. Well, on the way home that night, me and my friend Trey were going to get back on the subway to go back to my grandma's house in New Jersey. And I swear to you, this guy walks up to us with 2 giant bags full of loaves of bread he was about to throw out. He worked at a restaurant. He's like, here, do you guys want this bread? And he gives me 2 massive bags of bread after I had passed around, I want to say it was 2 loaves of bread. I might be remembering that part wrong, but it was kind of this, like, for me, with my guru, if you will, my spiritual teacher, it was like, oh, here's the instant karma. Here's the magic of what happens around this woman. And when you're around this woman, it's like, it's a different vibration. It's a beautiful experience. So that was my first taste of, seeing Amma, and I got very devotional, and I was really into that path. And I tried to be a good, almost like a Hindu type Amma devotee at first. And I got a little too hardcore into that. And I was a little too, didn't quite fit me. I'm more of an independent thinker, as you might have gathered by this point, and I don't want to be confined to one box. I don't like it. Not to say I don't want to go deeply within one thing, but so eventually I kind of relax on that a little bit, and I get more open to more things again. But I think to some degree, you have to believe. Like I've heard that the Dalai Lama has said that everyone should believe that their religion is the best religion, and
Mhm.
I think there's something to that as far as like you want to go deeply into something, you gotta drink the Kool-Aid a little bit. You gotta really believe it,
Mhm.
and I don't mean anything weird and cultish by that. I mean to say,
Yeah.
you have to really believe it, and so you got to buy it, and so I've had phases of life where I buy into something for a while, and that allows me to kind of peer into that world, and then I usually pull my head back out and go, okay, well now I can see a little more of the whole picture maybe, or I'm kind of putting this mosaic together over time of spirituality for myself. So that becomes a thing, and then basically I'm practicing astrology, and I'm exploring different spiritual traditions at different times. I'm doing a meditation practice, and then eventually I have kids. I have 3 kids, and so that becomes a big focus of my life. I still do it, and I'm divorced, but I live in a duplex where my former wife lives on the other side of it, and
Mhm.
my 10-year-old and my 13-year-old, they go back and forth every week between the two sides of the duplex, and she comes over and says goodnight to them at night, and we're friendly and we're good co-parents because we both love our kids to death. And so that's a huge part of my journey, and they've been around like the Amma scene a little bit too. So they were all blessed by her when they were in the womb. She literally fed all of them their first food. It's a Hindu tradition thing where the guru will feed the child their first food. And so we did that with all of them, and that was like a beautiful ceremony for each of them. And so I've tried to surround them with these spiritual influences, and hope that there's grace, in their lives. And I was just telling them the other day, we just went up to Utah for a trip. We went through Zion and went up to Provo and Salt Lake and checked out some stuff. But I told them I think that I know it's hard to understand this when you're young, but I think that the thing that's really real, it's not this world, it's not the stuff that's always coming and going here. There's something deeper than that. And you call it spiritual, call it God, whatever. But the closer you are to that, I think, the more you seek that, and are interested in that as opposed to just the worldly items, and the worldly satisfactions and pleasures. The more closer you get to reality, and the more likely you are to have some grace in your life. And I just encourage them to just keep their mind open to that, and pursue that in their lives, because someday maybe I won't be here, and I hope that they still have that connection to a higher power like that.
Mhm. That's awesome. Well,
Yes.
in the interest of time, I'm going to collapse the last two questions into one.
Okay.
Given your background and exposure to multiple religions and your study of multiple religions, um, you know, and you've mentioned that religion has a mixed effect on the world. Um, we're a quarter of the way into the 21st century, which someone rudely reminded me of
Yeah,
recently.
that is quite rude. Yes.
Um, and I think about how what religion's role is going to be in the coming, years and centuries. What do you think religion's role is to be in the coming, as your children have children of their own and grandchildren and so on? Do you think it's going to be more that the world's going to gradually become more secular? Are the ancient religions and beliefs of our ancestors going to continue to propagate? What do you think the future of religion is, and will it continue to be kind of a mixed bag, or do you think that there's some mostly positive effect or mostly negative effect that's going to come? And I'm speaking mostly of religion, not necessarily
Right.
spirituality, but feel free to take that whatever direction you want to.
Yeah, that's a definitely important question. I mean, I'm looking at what's happened in the U.S., where we've been becoming more secular. We're becoming less religious, although there's times where there's more revivals of religion too. And it is true, more younger people, for example, believe in astrology these days, and that's an example of a kind of a more liberal, becoming more liberal to some degree around religion. But at the same time, people tend to go off in these different directions. So while this group over here is becoming more liberal in their thinking toward religion, then these other groups are going to go harder into what they're holding on to, particularly because the people who do believe they've found the truth, the light, the way, and everybody needs it, it's almost like it suggests that you're supposed to force it on everybody and try to convert everybody. And now let's change maybe the laws of our land in the United States so that we're not really believing in the same religious freedoms perhaps that we once did. And so I think the tension in a way is increasing, between people that don't want to follow that path and then some of those who do. I mean, you can look at, there's people talk about sort of Christian nationalism these days in the US and stuff like this. And so, the people who really believe they've got the whole truth, they do tend to become more dogmatic generally a bit over time and want to really kind of drive that home. And I think we're at a bit of a low point in our culture in America in terms of, really understanding some of the fundamentals that our country was based on. I mean, freedoms and liberty. And we're becoming quite hypocritical, like, oh, my side gets free speech, but your side doesn't, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And so that's really concerning to me because there's an inevitable clash there. And often, of course, religion becomes a tool that gets twisted into supporting, let's say, more authoritarian sort of approaches to life. I mean, you look at something obvious like the Taliban in Afghanistan, and it's easy enough for us to look at that and see how, oh, that doesn't look good. But, in what ways are we becoming like that, really? So I kind of see that clash being there, and it's such a struggle for me because I believe so much in the general value of religion and a spiritual approach to life. And I mean, yes, you don't have to be religious to be moral. That's quite true. But it has served the purpose of guiding human beings toward morality in so many cases, over the centuries. And I think we do need that. So if we don't have so much religion, I think we need something that reminds us to be good humans, and it's just now there's so much proliferation of ideas because of how open the world is and how the borders aren't as real anymore, and so there's all these ideas are going to continue to kind of intermingle. So I want to say it can play such a valuable role. I want to be optimistic. I want to be positive toward other people's religions and accept that there's good in them. But we know from history that human beings often go through dark periods where stupidity reigns and small-heartedness reigns and control reigns, and religion's always going to be used by some people for their own agendas when they're not good-hearted people, and they are going to try to make it about manipulation, control, and so that's what's so sad about it, is that there's such a beautiful thing there. And yet it keeps getting perverted. And yet, a certain number of people do get it on a higher level. But, collectively, take a look at humanity. A lot of us don't get the important stuff, too. So I want to argue for religion's role in the world, but I also want to argue for it to become a more inclusive force for love and elevation of human spirit. And when it becomes more based in hate and control and things like that, yeah, I don't think it's religion anymore, but tell that to the people who practice it that way,
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's, I think it's part of the inevitable tragedy of the duality of life that there's always going to be people misusing the good stuff for their own selfish aims. And one last comment, I think that the more healthy we become, the more we are looking at our psychology, the more we're looking at healing. I mean, the narcissists that probably had horrible childhoods where they weren't shown love, and they were abused or they were manipulated. And so a lot of those people grow up to be horrible narcissists, because they didn't get the love that maybe that they needed. And I'm lucky. My mom was wonderful. My grandma was wonderful. And I was around good humans. And, hopefully I turned out all right, and yet a lot of people are trapped in these cultures that are not so great. And then you look at Idiocracy in the first 5 minutes of that movie.
Yeah.
You kind of see what's going on there, and how are we going to turn the ship around when that's the reality these days.
Unfortunately, that film was kind of prophetic, but yeah. Well, Moses, I want to thank you for your time. and this was a delight.
Thank you. Me too, Scott.
as as I knew it would be. So before we let you go, tell us where we can find you and where we can find out more about your astrology and all that good stuff.
Yeah. I have a few social media things. Mostly I work with clients and students these days. Like I'm lucky to have a bit of a following without really being out there too much, but I'm still out there a little bit. But my main astrology website is astrologyforthesoul.com. It's all spelled out. And I am working on some projects. I may do a podcast myself at some point. I may get my astrology book written at some point or books written at some point. So hopefully there'll be some other things to tap into there. If you read speculative fiction, I have a couple old epic fantasy novels out there too. But yeah, probably from that website or just even Googling my name, you'd probably see whatever I'm up to.
You have the advantage of there probably not being too many Moses Siregars out there. I have the unfortunate competition of a sports writer / hockey player who has my name. Yeah,
that
and
is
he and I fight for that first place, that first page on Google. So I have to tell people I'm not a hockey player or a sports writer, as hard as that is to believe.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah, Siregar is actually a pretty common Indonesian name. So there's quite a few Siregars, and
Oh, really?
There are even some Moses Siregars, but I think I do have the biggest Google footprint out of them all. So yeah.
Well, and how many of them are astrologers?
Good call. Yeah. You can literally just Google Moses astrology, and I'll be the first thing that will come up. So
see whereas if you Google Scott Roche writer, again, hockey player, and me. So you have to be specific and say horror writer or science fiction writer, and then you'll get me. So,
that is a different problem.
Hey, thank you so much. You have a great day.
You too. Wish you all the best.